Thank you for joining us for What If We Could Build Journalism from Scratch, a conversation with Solutions Journalism Network's co-founders, David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg, hosted by Sree Sreenivasan. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Solutions Journalism Network's website. Here's our host, Sree Sreenivasan.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much for being with us. If you're live, thank you. If you're watching on the recording, thank you as well. We are live on various channels. Please share this conversation. It's going to be a very important one, very timely conversation about journalism, the media, and so much more. And tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you and would love to get your questions and comments as well. From the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, we have seen the power of information, the power of journalism for good and for bad. We're seeing right now in real time in Ukraine the damage that can be done with misinformation, disinformation, and how journalists are handling these on behalf of consumers of news. We're also seeing the bravery of journalists who, at a time when everyone else is exiting Ukraine, people are going into the battlefield. We're going to get to talk about all of this with our very special guests, David and Tina, the co-founders of Solutions Journalism Network. Thank you all for being here with us, and we're going to get right into it and ask lots of great questions from you, and I'm going to ask some questions as well. So let's bring on David and Tina and talk about where we are and how we would think about building journalism from scratch. What if we got to start again? So, hi, David. Thank you for being here. And let's go to you with that question. What is the premise of this? What does this mean to think about even starting journalism from scratch?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. I think for me, the question is, what are the kinds of stories that do two things in the world that's needed to solve the problems and build a better world? It's to mobilize the sense of urgency and awareness, and also to mobilize the agency to be able to deal with problems effectively. We've seen that, in addition to Ukraine, which is dominating, the headlines right now, we still have a crisis of 9 million people facing starvation in Afghanistan. We've got democracy under threat in the United States. There's obviously the climate crisis. There's COVID. I mean, if you really add up all of the stuff that's going on in the world, and then you put it on a 24/7 feed that is constantly driving people's sense of urgency and anxiety and fear, what ends up happening is that agency actually goes down. People shut down. They start avoiding the news, as we've seen. The research shows that news avoidance is on the rise. And so I think the big question that we're facing now is, how do you build an information, a sort of a feedback system that is timely and accurate, that mobilizes the awareness and urgency we need without paralyzing people, without causing people to bury their heads in the sand or to blame the messenger or to deny the message, which is really what we've seen now. And so that's really the big question. And I think, one of the core principles in building journalism from scratch would be to really understand human behavior and human psychology and be much more skillful in balancing information that freaks people out, that tells them really how severe the problems are, but also information that helps people understand what are the options, what are the responses that are emerging, where could we pay more attention in terms of responses and potential solutions that are emerging.
Thank you. And I think obviously we can think of the climate crisis as an example of where people may not respond the way we necessarily want them to if we give them specific kinds of information. So let's bring Tina into the conversation. And this idea of building journalism from scratch implies that there's a problem with journalism. So tell us what you see as the problems of journalism today.
Well, Sree, thank you so much for having us today to talk about this super important issue. I mean, journalism is now unrecognizable compared to what it looked like just about 20 years ago. It's totally changed in its platform. It's totally changed in its business model. But the part that hasn't totally changed is the content. And what we would like to see is journalists rethinking their definition of news to think about getting off autopilot, stop doing it the way we've always done it, just because it's the way we've always done it, and think about what is it that our communities need? How can we best serve them? What is presenting an accurate picture of what is going on today? And I think regardless of what the crisis is that's going on, these are going to be ongoing. They obviously should be covered. We're not saying you shouldn't cover that, but we're giving people an inaccurate picture of the world if we're not also telling them what is going on, what people are doing to try to solve these problems. Journalism that only focuses on the negative is distorting the reality. It's looking at the world through a funhouse mirror, and it has the bad side effects of depressing citizenship, of depressing news consumption, of making people feel more cynical and distrusting, not only of institutions, but of each other. And we need to give a more accurate picture in how we think of the word news.
And we're using this hashtag, folks, news that works, hashtag news that works. Please follow the conversation. Please add your comments and your questions here. We already have a couple of people saying hello, so let's say hi back to them. I saw Alina was saying hello. Jigger is watching from New York. And let's see, Alina's also watching from New York on LinkedIn. And we have Paula watching on Facebook from Tallahassee. Very excited to hear the expertise David and Tina have to share. And we're on these multiple channels, so we want to have that conversation. So please jump in if you can, and if you have a question. So in terms of, Tina, if I can just come back to you, give us some examples, please, of specific instances, topics, issues that you think would benefit from a new framework that were done in the old framework.
Sure. One example that comes to mind is the Ebola epidemic of 2014. Everyone in the world knew about it. Billions of people knew about what was going on in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. But what people didn't know was that in neighboring countries like Nigeria, Mali, and Senegal, they had caseloads that were in the single or double digits, but they managed to control them. How did they do that? People didn't know that there is a vaccine for Ebola that's almost 100% effective. They didn't know that there is a treatment for Ebola that's very effective. And those are parts of the story that get left out when all you do is cover the catastrophe.
And that's a great example. And right here in New York City, where I'm based today, I remember we had a patient who had Ebola, or someone had been exposed to Ebola, and the kind of nonstop 24/7 coverage of that made it sound like the entire city was in danger, or America was in danger. And that kind of at one-way lens that we looked at it was obviously wrong.
Another way that this is hugely important right now is in journalism's sense of fairness and equity. White-led journalism, which is the mainstream media, is in crisis right now about these issues. And journalists and newsrooms are thinking very carefully about how we can diversify our newsrooms and bring in reporters, journalists, editors, leaders that more accurately represent our community. And that is hugely important. But we have to acknowledge at the same time that most newsrooms are not growing, they're shrinking. And so that is a long-term problem we have to solve. Something we can do right now, though, is change the way we cover marginalized communities. It's been interesting to see many news organizations print apologies for how they participated in coverage of racial terror and lynchings in a way that actually promoted these things. And the Montgomery Advertiser is one newsroom did a front page apology of Time to Face the Past about the paper's own role in creating this distorted coverage of Black people. But what newsrooms are not noticing is that a form of that is still going on today. If we look at coverage of low-income communities of color right now, for example, Englewood in Chicago or Brownsville in Brooklyn, what we see is a steady diet of stories about crime. And very often the criminal justice reporter is the only person who goes into these neighborhoods. And that creates a just very distorted sense of what these communities are all about. These stories are true, but they don't give a true picture of what's going on in Brownsville and Englewood. And so it's really important to also look at what folks in these communities are doing that are trying to solve these problems and other solutions that they're coming up with. It's a racial injustice to cover these communities purely through the lens of crime. And we have to think about that right now and do something about it right now.
And we're going to get to some of the solutions that we have for that. I just want to put up, if we can, that image from the Montgomery Advertiser, that newspaper. It's so striking the way they did this. And we've seen multiple papers do this, David, over the last few months. This is all the George Floyd effect that we're seeing and part of that racial reckoning we're having in this country. Can you tell me, what this means that they did, that the Advertiser did that, other papers have done something similar? What has that meant in the newsroom? What has that meant to their cities, David?
Yeah, I would say, and I think a really important distinction here is when you're changing your coverage, the answer is not suddenly to shift, okay, what are we going to do now? We're only going to cover good news. We're not just going to, that's not what we're talking about. It's not like you go into a community and you try to tell rosy stories to change people's perceptions or affect. As Tina said, the idea is to tell the whole story, is to cover, if there are problems in a community, those are worth covering. But in any community, there are people responding to problems. There's always people doing things. There's always agency. There's aspirations. There's capacity. There's creativity. If you don't also cover those sides of the story, what you're doing is you're framing people. You're essentially defining people by their problems, which is fundamentally self-fulfilling because it leads to disinvestment. It leads to perceptions that increase the risks of violence, that will drive police violence, that will drive mass incarceration. So the story that gets told actually ends up creating, and shaping the problem to come. So the answer is to go in there with eyes that look at the question, who's doing better against this problem? Who's working to solve this problem? Where's the evidence? Is it working? Solutions journalism is not good news. It's very rigorous reporting that's interrogating people trying to solve problems. And the thing that is often misunderstood, because the name Solutions Journalism Network often gives journalists the wrong assumption, it's really fundamentally an accountability mechanism. Because when you can show that another county, another school, another hospital, another police department is performing better, is doing something smarter, has reduced racial profiling, has increased the graduation rate, has reduced the infection rate, what happens is that creates a lot of pressure on other people to also improve their performance. So in the end, by showing what's possible, who's doing better, by asking that question systematically and then interrogating the differences in performance and the differences in real effort that are being put in different places, you end up driving people to improve their processes, and you're creating FOMO, or you're creating competitive pressures that actually can be just as useful in accountability as the best investigative journalism, and in fact are often combined with investigative journalism.
So again, where we see a lot of investigative journalism focusing on finding the problems, you're saying we can put that kind of energy, that kind of skills, that kind of way in which you do storytelling into finding solutions and exposing solutions.
Yes, and actually, one of the difficulties of investigative news organizations that do investigative journalism all the time, and we've spoken to their reporters, is that it's very hard for somebody to consume one bad story after another, after another, after another. People end up avoiding the message. And so you've done this extraordinary research, and you've gone through 1,000 documents, and you've come up with a really important story. But people, at the end of the day, they're like, Ukraine, Afghanistan, COVID, I've had enough. And so if people can't consume it and can take it in, and if they can't take it in and think, what is there to be done about this? Isn't there any place that's responding to this, whether it's at an individual level of an agency or one department or whatever? It's a way of giving people sort of a handle to hold on to a really difficult story. And we've seen this over and over again. When you're asking people, we want you to engage with a really difficult subject, the subject that's painful and scary, and we want you to do it every day. You need to give people a sense of efficacy. You need to give people a sense of hope, but credible hope, not just, hero stories, something that's real that they can look at, and in some cases governments can invest more in and can look more in these solutions that are covered throughout our network are almost always underfunded. There are almost always too few places that are doing better than everyone else. So there's always a chance to cross-pollinate those ideas and allow them to spread and grow.
Thank you, folks. We're talking about building journalism from scratch. What would we do to make journalism better? And we have some answers, as you're about to hear. We have already heard some already. Please tell us where you're watching from. Please ask your questions and we'll bring them in here. Karen's watching from Rochester, New York. Welcome, Karen, on LinkedIn. Sharon's watching from Chicago on Facebook. So glad you're having this conversation on so many platforms today. Everyone, hit share, tag a friend who you know may not have time to watch now, but they can watch later. The show will air right again on all these platforms. Here is Gawat saying, hello from Poland. We badly need a new scope on journalism, especially now with the humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine. I can't imagine how busy journalists are in the Ukraine at the moment, and in Ukraine, and of course in Poland as well. So thank you for tuning in at this moment. Asunta says, hello from Italy. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you for watching, everyone. Tag a friend, hit share. Please follow SOL Journo on Twitter so that you can see the great ideas coming from the network. And also, please follow our great guests. You can see their Twitter handles on the screen. I want to go to Tina with a question about journalists and the way that journalists are built, especially investigative journalists. As you know, they make their living on getting those hard-hitting stories that get people to sit up in the old days, at the breakfast newspaper and now online. And do they push back when you say, try some of the things that David was talking about? Are they open to this, or do you get them saying, I'd rather go out and find the problems rather than the solutions?
You are totally right, Sree. I mean, investigative journalists are a cynical bunch, and there has been pushback. They're the last people to get this, because their view is, my job is to uncover problems, not to burnish someone's reputation. And I totally agree with that. And what we're saying is, your job is not to burnish someone's reputation, but your job is to show possibilities for how some of these problems can be solved. And that doesn't make your story weaker. It makes it stronger, because you're taking away the excuses of people who are behaving badly by showing that, hey, over here, 60 miles away, there's another city with the same resources we have, and they're doing a much better job. That is what is profoundly embarrassing to government officials and to business officials and to NGOs, showing that someone else is doing better. That way they can't say, oh, we're doing the best we can. This is a terrible problem. If you really want to have impact, it's very important to show models of what is possible.
Okay, so to you investigative journalists who are watching us live, we'd love to hear from you. Jump in the comments, post your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Let's go to David to talk a little bit about Solutions Journalism Network. What are the kinds of ways in which you are doing new things? What are things that people will learn looking at your website, learning about your membership and folks who are part of the network? So please talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So the network it's a collection of journalists around the world. I mean, one thing I want to make clear is we did not invent the idea of solutions journalism. It's been around for a long time. It's particularly been around and very strongly practiced by the Black press in the United States, because of the fact that communities, when we talk to journalists, they say, reporting only on problems is a privilege for my community. We can't afford it. We need to figure out what we can do about it. So that's one thing we want to make clear is solutions journalism is an idea that has been part of journalism, but it's really around the world now rising because of, the things that we talked about before, the need to have more of a balance, especially in this 24/7 world of constant news feeds. What the network is doing is we have worked with direct training with close to 600 news organizations. We've engaged with close to 27,000 journalists in different modes of training. We have lots of online resources and workshops, but increasingly we're shifting to what we call, sort of a system change kind of mode of working, where we're working with other organizations and with other trainers around the world so that the approach can really be systematized. So we've got training partnerships with the European Journalism Center, with Nigeria Health Watch, with Science Africa in Africa, with Transitions in Eastern Europe, with Journalists for Human Rights in Canada. We also have partnerships with close to 40 journalism schools in the United States, where solutions journalism is being integrated into the teaching of journalism. We have partnerships with individual journalists who are fellows or trainers in lots of different parts of the world, in about 20 countries now, who see as one of the things that they want to do as part of their practice is to be able to, help other journalists, develop the skills around solutions journalism. It is a skill set. Individual journalists who are fellows or trainers in lots of different parts of the world, in about 20 countries now, who see as one of the things that they want to do as part of their practice.
I think we're having
to be able to,
I think we're
help
having
other journalists, develop the skills around solutions journalism. It is a skill set. Individual journalists who are fellows or trainers in lots of different parts of the world, in about 20 countries now, who see as one of the things that they want to.
Sorry, folks, we had a little bit of echo. We'll get David back in just a minute. Tina, we're doing basically a world tour. Folks are watching from all over, so let's see where else people are watching us from, and then we'll get David to finish his thought there. We have folks I know watching from lots of very interesting places, so let's show some of those folks. I see someone's watching from Colombia, Philippe, and Monica's watching from Costa Rica. There's a question from Philippe here about approaches to environmental journalism solutions. We'll talk about that. So thank you, Philippe, for watching from Colombia. Here's Monica from Costa Rica. Let's see who else we've got. Folks from Jefferson City, Missouri. Catherine, thank you for being here on YouTube. Again, you folks, you can see we're on all the platforms. Please ask questions. And Janice watching from Toronto, Canada. Welcome. And David, I'll let you finish your thought, and then we're going to come to you with some questions from our audience.
Okay, thank you. That was weird, that echo.
But did you notice how well you sound, how good you sounded?
So good, he had to say it 3 times.
Yeah.
I guess, to sum up that, it was kind of a long, there is this practice change is emerging around the world as people are all trying to deal with so many issues that are, coming together at the beginning of this century. And what we're seeing is we have this phrase, we call it all teach, all learn, where there's journalists in the Middle East who are saying, what is the application? There was a panel recently, what is the application to the Middle East crisis, to the conflict in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How do we apply this? Journalists in Africa are looking at, how do we apply this in a context where we're reaching out to communities around, core human development and economic development issues. In the United States, it's really been applied very, very heavily around issues around voting rights and racial justice and police violence. So what you can see is that around the world, there's this shift of like, what are we looking for? Not only just the problems to cover, but the adaptive resilience that's emerging at this point in history. And then how do we share that as widely as possible? So it's very exciting to see this kind of many-to-many learning ecosystem get born. And our job, or what we are trying to help, is just really celebrate, create those linkages, help people who are interested in this find out where they can learn more about it, and then really just be part of the conversation at a very large level.
Thank you. And we have some great questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to go to the question from Philippe asking about environmental journalism and solutions for environmental journalism. Thank you for watching from Colombia. Let's go to Tina on that question first.
I'd actually throw that one to David.
Okay, we'll go to David.
Yeah, so I would say, the climate crisis is one of the areas where the coverage has really been kind of apocalyptic and unsolvable. And, the headlines, freak people out, frankly. I mean, we've seen coverage of the Doomsday Glacier in Antarctica, which has been covered in such a way that people think, we're going to be, it's going to melt in 5 years and we'll all be 10 feet underwater. This kind of coverage basically shuts people down. And there's lots of research that says that it is important for people to understand that the threat is real, and we're every day getting more information about the true nature of the threat. That's 100% necessary. It's also true that only something like 2 to 5% of stories that cover climate crisis look at opportunities to solve problems. I mean, that's really out of balance. When you have a 95%, if you go to a doctor's appointment and they spend 95% of it telling you how sick you are and only 5% of it telling you what your treatment options are, you're not going to go to that doctor again. You're going to go to another doctor that will help you understand, what can I do about this thing? And that's the big question in the world today. What can we do? What are our policy options? What are our business options? How do we mitigate? How do we adapt? How do we build resilience? So the biggest thing in journalism right now is to correct that balance. So there's more journalism that's really looking at what adaptation and mitigation and resilience look like. Balance that out with the stories that have to keep coming, of course, to understand the threat and the different dimensions of the threats. But that's really it. And it goes back to like urgency and agency. If you're going to give people a sense of urgency, if you're going to give them anxiety, you also have to, as much as possible, credibly build that sense of agency. Show them where are the ideas that are emerging. Otherwise, you'll lose them. And that's what we're seeing today.
I like the idea of mitigation and resilience as things that you can push for. Oh, we've got a question here from Sharon.
Just to add to that, there's research that also shows that cynicism is self-fulfilling. That in fact, if you look at the journalist like theory of change, it's like the best way to avert catastrophe is to keep people focused on the potential for catastrophe, 24/7. And that's actually completely wrong. It turns out that is more likely to be self-fulfilling than corrective. And that's a really important, that's a behavioral insight. But I think journalists really need to understand that we're dealing with human beings. We're not dealing with Mr. Spock from Star Trek. We need to understand the human nervous system and how people absorb information, and then when shutdown occurs.
Thank you. Let's go to the question from Sharon, who asks, can you address the challenges journalists, including student journalists, face finding the people who are responding to problems? It's one thing for journalists who are embedded in neighborhoods, but what about those, again, especially students who are not embedded, so may not know all the players, and all they see are the things right in front of them? So who'd like to tackle that?
I can tackle that. I think this combines with another great question that we've gotten, which is about, are we not sort of minimizing the problem by offering small solutions? Like, you feel really weird talking about a huge problem like climate change and then saying, well, let's change our light bulbs. I mean, that's a 5-ounce solution to a 5-ton problem. And you don't want that. You want to be highlighting solutions and responses to problems that are of the appropriate weight. So one way to do that is to start with data. Take a problem, look at a database that looks at that problem, cut it into small slices. Climate change is big, so take a small piece of it, recycling rates, coral reef bleaching. There's an infinite number of small pieces, and there's data on all of them. And look at who's doing better, and then investigate how were they able to achieve being at the top of that list. So that's one way for journalists to find stories that are the appropriate weight, because you're looking at data about the country of Belize has managed to keep its coral reefs alive. I'm making this up. That may not be true, actually. But then you're going to look at what Belize did to do that. And so that's, by definition, a response that's important and replicable and meaty. And that's important to do. And it also is a way for journalists who are not embedded in communities and maybe you're sitting at your desk and you can't travel because of COVID, or more long-term, you can't travel because your newsroom has no money. It allows you to get started in finding responses to cover. Sree, I want to say something important, which people are probably thinking about because of Ukraine, but solutions journalism is not a way to cover breaking news. We are not going to be using this to cover what's going on in Ukraine in terms of the progress of the war. It is a way to do feature stories on how people are responding. So not this week, but maybe next week or the week after, you could do solutions journalism stories on towns in the Ukraine that have managed to keep their lights on and school going and their hospitals running despite the fact that they're being bombarded. That's a potential solutions journalism story. But you would not use this as a tool to look at what the breaking news of the moment is.
Yeah, that's very helpful to understand that. Folks, we've got about another 30 minutes with our terrific guest speakers here, David and Tina, who are co-founders of Solutions Journalism Network. Please follow them on Twitter, and please share this conversation. We're getting great comments from people all over the world telling us how important this is. So tag a friend, and they can watch it later on any of these platforms: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. David, I think it'd also be helpful for our audience to just hear a little bit about the genesis of the network and how that happened. And if you can throw in a little bit about both of your backgrounds as well, so people know who you are.
Sure, absolutely. Can I add one more thing about climate change that just occurred to me that I think is more specific? One of the issues with climate change journalism that has pushed people away from the issue is that it's been very science-led. Like a lot of stories talking about 2 degrees Celsius or 400 parts per million, things like that. The research shows that people absolutely don't connect with 400 parts per million. It's not something that is going to move people emotionally. The frames that really, and we work with hundreds of news organizations, so we've talked to a lot of editors. The number one issue that news organizations in our network feel that the solutions frame should be applied to is climate change right now. Economic mobility would be the number 2 issue. And what you end up happening is people saying things like, we need to cover this issue through the lens of the climate change that is causing more extreme flooding in our community, the climate change that is causing our insurance rates to go up, the climate change that is causing more extreme heat waves that are endangering our elders. We need to understand that. And here's what we can do about it. Here's what other communities are doing about it who have had similar problems and have seen some success, have protected themselves from more frequent flyers and so forth. It's that frame that really connects it to a human impact, especially at the local level if you can, and then helps people understand what their options to respond are at the local level. This has been shown to be the best way to reduce motivated denial and deep skepticism among many communities that climate change is even a problem. So it's just really important to go away from that scientific frame and really lead with the human.
Just to be clear, though, that obviously we want to follow the science, but frame it in a way that people understand it. We've seen that the most important scientists are the ones being attacked the most in terms of the pandemic. So the very science is sometimes used because some things aren't exactly what we're saying will happen, and then people are focused on that. So those who want to spread misinformation and disinformation, look for any daylight between what we say is a fact and the timeline when something might happen. And as we know, science, as exact as it can be, can sometimes not be precise in the way we want it to be. So
right.
David, back to you.
People to use the science, not to be completely resistant to facts, which is we now have a situation where people won't even accept the facts on many things, on vaccines, on all sorts of things. And so we're still dealing with that problem of receptivity to the information as well as the quality of the information itself. And those are the things that, especially in the climate issue, have shown to be, very important. Okay, so Genesis. So both Tina and I have been journalists for, I don't know exactly how long Tina has been, but I've been a journalist for 32 years and started as a, beat reporter at New York Newsday. And then over the years, I had a couple of stories that I wrote and some books that really showed me the impact of a solutions frame. I'd written a book about microfinance and the Grameen Bank, which really showed me that was a personal issue. Tina had a really powerful, enormous impact with the story she wrote about Brazil being the first country to make antiretroviral drugs available for everyone who was HIV positive in almost 20 years ago now, or over 20 years ago. Seeing the impact that story had after trying to pitch it as an investigative story, which the Times didn't take. The Times, New York Times Magazine, they accepted it, and she took a solutions frame, and it had much bigger impact. Those were sort of these epiphany moments that we had. That led us to many years later to start a column at the New York Times called Fixes, which was Tina's idea. that we wrote for 11 years, which is basically a weekly column looking at efforts to solve problems. And that's where we really learned that, one, there's lots and lots of stories that are really credible, can be covered. You'll never run out. At one point, I had with 800 story ideas for a weekly column, which translates to 16 years of stories, ideas. And we just saw, wow, there's good stories to be covered. We can tell them well. When you write them, people really engage with them. And yet journalism has this historic bias against this kind of coverage. And that's what really led us to start the network in 2012 and think and see if we could, help other journalists who also wanted to do this, because this is not something that we built in a vacuum. We had many conversations with journalists, and they said, yeah, these pitches are hard to get across. Editors are reluctant to accept them. And so that was really the genesis for, well, maybe there's a way to open up the channels to have more of this reporting.
Well, thank you for doing that. And I want to say to everybody watching, if you're trying to get a grasp on what exactly a successful solutions journalism story is, well, please take a look at the website. They have a wonderful story tracker there. And when you go onto the story tracker, you can see everything from food waste to gender equity to racial issues to the climate crisis. You can find stories that are featured there, and they will help you understand what it is. There you go, the Solutions Story Tracker, and 12,900 stories from 6,900 journalists, 1,600 news outlets, 187 countries. This is not a nascent movement. This is a movement that is already having an impact, as you can see, every day around the world. Tina, you must be so proud of this.
Yeah, I really am. And one thing I'm most proud of, Sree, is that the vast majority of the newsrooms that contribute stories to the tracker are small newsrooms. And we had a question that I want to talk about from Melissa about how tiny newsrooms can use solutions journalism. I mean, when we came out of the New York Times, our first partner at the Solutions Journalism Network was the Seattle Times, because we needed the legitimacy and credibility by working with these very legitimate, credible newsrooms. But now the issue is, for most newsrooms that are struggling, and they're small, they may not have been small 20 years ago, but they're small now because our resources are dwindling. How do we use this? Because this is time-intensive reporting, like all enterprise reporting is. So at SJN, we have really concentrated on working with smaller and smaller newsrooms, building collaborations, working in the South and the Midwest and the Mountain West with newsrooms that are, if not in news deserts, in news savannas, as David likes to call them. And here's the way solutions journalism is relevant even to the smallest newsroom, which is, think about what is going to inspire someone in your community to value your work. And it's not doing clickbait. It's not doing press conferences. It's not doing the same stories that they can get everywhere, because people now on the internet have dozens and hundreds of places to get the same news. It's creating enterprise reporting that is the highest value work you can do with your dwindling resources. That is what is going to keep your community valuing you and loyal to you and attuned to you. So if I had a newsroom with 2 people in it, I would have those 2 people doing enterprise stories, doing solution stories, but also doing profiles, doing investigations, doing explanatory reporting. That, I think, is, and that actually forces a newsroom to really think about, what is the value that I can give my community? What is the way that I can interpret covering the news in a way that matters the most to the people that I serve?
Thank you. That's a great way to look at it, folks. I'm Sree Sreenivasan in New York. That's David, and that's Tina. We're talking about Solutions Journalism Network and this idea of building journalism from scratch. And we have lots of great comments coming in, so we're going to read some of the comments and also bring up a couple of questions in about 15-20 minutes that we have left. Tell us where you're watching from. If you've come across a solutions journalism story and have a question about how you would make that work, you've got the experts here. You can ask them. And it's just great to see people are watching from as far away as Botswana and as close as Toronto, as we can see on the screen. So we've got lots of things we do want to cover, and there's Sophie watching from Paris on YouTube. Please, everyone, tag a friend, hit share. This is such a valuable conversation that we're having, and Sean is in Lincoln, Nebraska, and there's Callistus in Botswana. Welcome. Thank you for all of you for being here and for being part of this. One of the things that we do want to try to understand is where are the people who are looking at solutions journalism and wondering about how, say, are we giving governments, are we letting them off the hook by not forcing them to do the big picture things they need to do instead of focusing on like the small things that are working?
I can address that.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, if you do it wrong, yeah, you're letting government off the hook. But if you do it right, you're actually looking at the lens of problems through the lens of who's doing better. And you are actually putting more pressure and accountability pressure on governments if we can show that other people are doing it better. There's nothing about solutions journalism that says you have to look at small pieces of an issue. You want to look at what a whole city is doing, what a whole state is doing. In the case of the article that David mentioned I had done about Brazil, what a whole country is doing. That's really important. We don't want to make these stories about kids and their lemonade stands to help people with cancer. Those are not, first of all, they're not solution stories at all, but they're not the most important kinds of solution stories. The important solution stories look at what are cities, what are hospitals, what are school systems that are having better results, and shining a light on that, investigating those results, and using those results to hold people who are not getting them accountable.
Thank you. That I think will help folks understand this. And we have some great other questions and comments. Please
go ahead. It's a way of creating pressure and accountability without feeding into fatalism or that sense of powerlessness. That is, we live in a world with billions of people who are basically information capturers. They're capturing information on their phones, videos, and they're sharing it with billions of other people. And this system just keeps getting faster and faster and faster. It's like a Ferrari that gets faster and faster, and it runs into a dirt track, which is called the human nervous system. And so, and that's why this, the information that says, hey, there's a county, 100 miles away that had our problem and has a much better policy to mitigate, like Tina, there are stories that look at the counties that you wouldn't expect that have really high vaccination rates in the United States, or the schools that you wouldn't expect that the high school graduation rate has increased over the last 5 years in a really low resource area. So that makes you wonder, like, what's possible? Are we really doing what's possible? And that's another way to create pressure, but without feeding into fatalism and overwhelming human beings with the news.
Nadir asks, what is the role of philanthropy in supporting the scaling of solutions journalism, and what are specific levers at a systems level to help pull?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is, nonprofit news in the United States is a growing industry. I mean, there's the American Journalism Project is doing really, really well with its support of nonprofit news organizations. We also have work with, we've done work with many of our news partners where, after working with them around the solutions journalism model, also helping them figure out how they can get local support around a project that they want to do, for example. So they go to maybe the local community foundation. In the United States, there's, I believe, something like 700 local community foundations. They're around the country, and they're important civic actors in their community that are all about trying to help build a better community. And so if the news organization says, we want to look at a problem in our community around mental health issues, and we're not just going to look at the problems, we're also going to look at and investigate, using a solutions journalism approach, what are some ideas that could help our community understand better options or better models to do that, and then go to the community foundation and say, now you should pay for this, because this is knowledge, this is R&D for our community to get better. And maybe even go to the local businesses and say, you should sponsor this because you're in our community and you need a healthy community in order to have a healthy business, so you should help support this. Or even just go direct to audience members and say, be a member, pay for this. And it's growing. It's still a small portion of what's needed. But we've seen from the news organizations that we've worked with who have applied this model that they're now bringing in new sources of revenues, which gets to Tina's point before of how do we help these small local news organizations do this enterprise value reporting if they don't have enough money. So obviously the money and the quality of the reporting go hand in hand. And so you can't separate sustainability from good journalism, especially at the local level.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes, so we're going to the lightning round. Lots of questions coming in. And here's one from Callistus in Botswana. How does one fuse solution stories with visual stories like graphs, pie charts, visual journalism, data visualization, things like that? Who'd like to answer that?
Well, like Tina's point before, the data is a really important part of solutions journalism. It's often what tells you where you should look. We call it we use the phrase positive deviance. This is a kind of a wonky phrase that indicates in a data set, who are the people that are performing better than you would expect. If you show that data in a visual format, there's also research that shows that people who would like to deny the problem or would like to minimize the problem are less likely to be resistant to a graphical depiction of information than actually just talking about it in words. So it's really important actually to use graphics skillfully in solutions journalism.
Okay, so that's very helpful. Thank you, and thanks to Callistus for that question. We have a question here from Jane, who says, "How do you get local newsrooms to keep writing about important topics, rising flood risks, for example, when their resources are spread thin?" And the answer is often, "We already did that story." That's something that I used to hear all the time from my editors, as if our readers, viewers are like keeping a tally and remember everything they saw, or are watching with an encyclopedic knowledge of our archives. So Tina, any thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, solutions journalism is actually a great answer to the problem of, well, we already covered that. People are in fact tired of hearing about the problem over and over again. And reporters are tired of writing about the problems over and over again. But you can give it a fresh approach. If you can say, we have this terrible flooding problem in our town. Everybody knows it. Let's look at how 5 of our neighboring cities have tried to solve this problem and what has worked for them and what has not worked for them. So solution stories are a really great answer to the problem of repeating yourself on the problem. They're also a good way of justifying why now. Why am I writing about this now? Because we're looking at something that's going on over here and being able to tell you how well it works.
Thank you. Folks, we have just a few more minutes, but if you've not been able to ask your question on social media, and if you have a question, you'll see my email address right on the screen, sree@digimentors.group. I'd be happy to ask that question. We do have a question about philanthropy, and what is the role of philanthropy in scaling solutions journalism efforts around the world? Over to one of you on that, and that's Nadir's question.
I'd like to take that if you don't mind, Sree.
Sure.
It's been crucial for us, and Solutions Journalism Network is a philanthropically funded organization, but increasingly all journalism is going to be. Advertising is dying as a way for journalism to stay alive. Facebook and Google are taking the vast majority, lion's share of online ads because they're very able to target in a micro way to the people that advertisers want to reach. And that is strangling newsrooms. And so increasingly newsrooms are turning to reader revenue, philanthropic revenue, and especially for newsrooms that serve readers who don't have a lot of money. Philanthropic revenue is extremely important.
Thank you. And this is a reminder to everyone watching. There's a big donate button right on the website of Solutions Journalism Network. So go in there, make a donation, support. They also have their gift policy there on what kind of money they do take. So that would be helpful for everyone to look at as well. We just have a few more minutes left with David and Tina. I'm learning so much myself. I know everybody is as well. Please tag, hit share, and people can watch this right from the beginning on all these platforms. It'll play right from the start. So, David, can you give us a sense of what are your priorities for 2022? Here we are, the beginning of March when we're talking. There's seems to be like an endless amount of problems that have solutions that journalism can shine a light on. What are you focused on?
Yeah, we have some real focus areas now, and this gets to the philanthropy question. We're really focusing on system change in journalism now. There's this really big platform that has grown up, and the opportunity is really there to make a major change in the kinds of in news coverage that really can support the kinds of issues that we're focused on now. We talked about climate change, the coverage of the climate crisis. It's so important to change the narratives and really get people to move away from hopeless and apocalyptic storytelling and thinking to what are the opportunities, where should we focus. We're also seeing it's really important to focus on democracy. We have a lot of focus on what's working to protect voter rights, to help support citizen mobilization. How do citizens really take and wield power? What does that look like? It's not just covering politics. We have a lot of focus on economic mobility and poverty. What are the models? That's an area where the narrative has been one of the worst narratives because it's individualized poverty. It's often, as Tina mentioned, going into communities that are experiencing poverty, but only ever focusing on the problems and the deficits and crime and things like that. So really looking at what are the emerging models to reduce inequality, to reduce poverty, to increase economic mobility. I mean, that's a few examples of the things that we're focusing on at the issue level. As an organization, we're also really, as we grow into this global sort of system change organization, we have to become a lot better at online learning because there's so much more that we can do. As we've all seen in the last 2 years, you can reach millions of people through these models much more quickly through online learning. Historically, we've done a lot of very direct workshops with news organizations. So that's a really big opportunity for us. And then really just learning how to build the architecture to connect the field and to facilitate learning from different news organizations, ideas, new models, how to raise revenues, how to deepen engagement, how to build trust, how to combine investigative journalism and solutions journalism, how to do the best solutions journalism around a particular issue area or in a low resource context or on WhatsApp or TikTok. These are all the kinds of things that we're really going to be investing in going forward to really advance this system change, which we think is this historic moment that we're playing in right now. So we're very, we're sort of all hands on deck right now.
I mean, we have an opportunity that we would not have had 10 or 20 years ago to reach journalists. Journalism is a defensive profession. And, back then, everything's fine. Why should we do anything different? But now journalists are very aware, hyper aware that everything is not fine. And one of the reasons that people have left the news, that people avoid the news, by far the biggest reason, all the research shows, there's research most recently from the Reuters Institute that shows, is it depresses me. It makes me feel powerless and depressed, and I want to go back to bed and pull the covers over my head, so I avoid the news. I think we all can feel in our guts what that is. And solutions journalism can be an antidote to that. So it's a very important way. I mean, as David likes to say, we offer a product as journalists that's painful to consume, and then we wonder why no one wants to pay for it. We've got to offer a product that makes people feel more involved and empowered and engaged.
And
just there's a huge normative component to this too. I mean, we talk about equity running through all of our work in terms of the narratives, the mental models that journalists give people determine what our systems will do. Ultimately, they shape our behaviors. They become our behaviors, and we are providing mental models of the world that make people feel scared of other people. If you go into a community and all you ever read about that community is crime, you are going to avoid that community, or you are going to try to fund fund systems that control that community or that hold it down. So there's a huge equity component to this, which is why it's so important. And we have a very specific aim. Like, we want to reach by 2025. This is a kind of audacious aim. At least half of all Americans, an increasing number of people globally, with news solutions journalism, news that integrates solutions journalism, however they get and receive their news. So that means lots of different news sources, different feeds, and we're not like avoiding you could achieve that aim just by going for like the top 5 news organizations, but that's not the goal. We really have to get it into the whole water supply of journalism. That's our hope and our dream, in fact.
We have very little time left, so I'm going to read 2 questions and then you can answer them as you like. Catherine asked about solutions journalism covering unionization, and you cover it differently from the way that traditional journalists have covered it. And another question is, Sophie asks, speaking of top 5 media organizations, about your Headway project with the Times, with the New York Times.
Sure.
Yeah, so Tina can do the Headway. She's been closer to that. We actually have an initiative that's getting going, focused on labor issues. So we'll have more to say about that soon. But right now, short of actually going back to the Solutions Story Tracker and seeing what are the emerging stories, I haven't looked very, very closely on how solutions journalism has covered labor in terms of having 5 stories in my head right now that I can think about. But in general, the approach is to move from a story focused on an argument to a story focused on a problem-solving process. So that would be applied to labor. And I'm actually, after this, I'm going to go into the story tracker and look at some of the labor stories. But I know we're going to be having a lot more coming out because of this initiative that's getting going.
Okay.
And Headway is a new initiative at the New York Times in the news section. In some ways, it is a successor to Fixes, our column, which has closed. That is looking at the world through the lens of progress in many different aspects of global issues. And it's just getting started, and it's very exciting, and we're happy to be participating.
Okay, so now I finally know what Headway means, making headway in dealing with problems, right? That's where the name comes from. So
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, now you've solved a mystery for me. Folks, there's so much more we could talk about and so many other questions coming in. We're not going to be able to cover that all today, but I'm going to give each of our guests a chance to give us a final thought. And I want to remind all of you to please check out the website, follow them on Twitter, and continue to engage with them. As you can see, there's so much happening every day with Solutions Journalism and the Solutions Journalism Network. So I'm going to go to each of our guests for a final thought. And David, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sree. There's this phrase in journalism, that goes back 100 years, more than 100 years. Sunlight is said to be the best disinfectant. And it's animated journalism for, pretty much the whole 20th century and continues to. And it basically says our job is to kill germs. We need to find the bad. We need to use light to identify the germs or the bad stuff and sort of draw attention to it, so our institutions will remain clean and healthy. There's another phrase that refers to light. It's better to light a candle than curse the darkness, which is another way of using light, which is you light a candle, you show people a pathway forward. You're not neglecting the dark corners. You're not saying the problems are to be avoided, but you're also using light to identify secrets that could help you, not just secrets that could harm you. And I think that image of the different uses of light, if you think of journalism as a highlighting mechanism, is a good balancing idea.
My plea to journalists would be to cover thoughtfully. Don't do things on autopilot. Think about what we do that serves our community best, and think about covering the whole story. A story can be an accurate story and yet contribute to a vastly inaccurate view of the whole. And we want to do balanced coverage that shows people a true picture of the world, because that is what journalism is for.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much. That's Tina Rosenberg. She's on Twitter at TI Rosenberg. Please follow her. And David Bornstein is at DN Bornstein on Twitter, the two co-founders of Solutions Journalism Network at Sol Journo, SOL Journo. Please follow them. They're also on Instagram, YouTube, of course, and solutionsjournalism.org. I'm at Sree on Twitter. Please continue to engage with them on the stories that we've been talking about and where we go from here. Sophie says, thank you, Tina and David. I'm an investigative journalist, and you inspire me so much. How wonderful is that? Thank you, Sophie. And thank you for everybody who's been watching from all over the world. This will start right away on all of these channels. Please hit share, tag a friend. Let's get this out there. And I know how much we all benefited from hearing these folks. So thank you, everybody, and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.